This evening we will have the new lecture of our series, Museums Talk from the United Kingdom, and Sam Thorne, Artistic Director, Tate St Ives, is our guest. And first of all, I would like to thank him for joining us. Welcome to Istanbul, Sam. Founded in 1993, Tate St Ives offers a varied exhibition and events program of international modern and contemporary art within the unique cultural context of St Ives, home of post-war British modernism. The museum also manages the Barbara Hepworth Museum and Sculpture Garden, which offers a remarkable insight into the work of one of Britain's most important 20th century artists. What can museums and larger art institutions learn from the recent flourishing of artist-led education projects? What would a museum with artist residencies at its core look like? Sam Thorne's talk will give an overview of alternative art school project from Manifesta 6 to Ahmet Öğüt Silence University and consider their implications for museums. It will draw on his experience as a co-founder of Open School East, an art school community space in London, and of developing a residency program at Tate St Ives. I would like to thank him for this wonderful collaboration to British Council Turkey, and now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Margaret Check, the British Council Turkey Director. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed, Levent Bey, and hoş geldiniz. Welcome to the 7th talk in the series of museums talk from the UK with our really very good partners here in Istanbul Modern. Since the start of the series last December, we've explored museums from diverse parts of the United Kingdom and from a variety of aspects. So we've explored them from their role, the role of museums in urban regeneration, through to building collections, and from the role of digital technologies in museums to the important role that museums will play in their communities for the future. So for more ideas on these topics, please, and if you would like to refresh or you would want to catch any of the earlier talks, please, you can watch any of the previous talks at any time in English or in Turkish on the British Council's Vimeo account. So just click through our website, www.britishcouncil.org.tr, and it takes you to the talks. So today, as we near the end of the UK Museums talks, which finish later this month, we're now looking at how museums can provide an appropriate context for artistic practice through artist-led education, and how a diverse range of artists and alternative perspectives can be presented through exhibitions and collections. And today we're traveling to Cornwall and St Ives. This is right at the tip of England's southwest coast, projecting right out into the Atlantic Ocean. When you stand on the harbour, you look out, and there is America. Very vast ocean of space before you. But Cornwall has a very specific and a very rich history, like many parts of countries that are at the edge of the countries. It also has incredible skies, luminous skies, and ever-changing seascapes. And they've long produced and inspired artists, most famously, as Levent Bey referred to, the sculptor Barbara Hepworth, who came with her painter husband, Ben Nicholson, in 1939 and never left. Now, I'm often asked in Turkey, what would be the equivalent of places in the UK? What would be their equivalent in Turkey? So I've been having a think about St Ives, and I have spent 2 years of my life in St Ives, so I know it very well. And of course, every place is unique. It's dubious to compare, but actually the nearest I think I can suggest would be Gümüşlük, or even perhaps Datça. Tate St Ives occupies a spectacular site high above the stunning surf beach of Porthmeor. It was built 22 years ago to celebrate the modernists, as well as the surroundings and the atmosphere that inspired them. And Tate St Ives, as Levent Bey has referred to, also manages the Barbara Hepworth Museum and Sculpture Garden, which offers a really remarkable insight into the world and work and outlook of one of Britain's most important 20th century artists. Since its opening in 1993, Tate St Ives has proved its worth, attracting 200,000 visitors, which is not bad for a seaside town of just over 11,000 people. It's also brought close to £12 million a year to the regional economy. And just like Tate Modern, Tate St Ives is also going through a major development that will double the gallery display space and provide more learning space, supporting a thriving visual arts and a wider cultural community in Cornwall. But before revealing any more, I'd now like to hand over to Sam Thorne for his talk on the lure of the local. Thank you and enjoy your evening. Tok Salden.
Good evening. Thank you, Margaret, for the introduction. And thank you to the British Council and to everyone here at Istanbul Modern for the invitation. I was talking to someone at the weekend and saying, telling them a bit about the situation that you've just described and saying, you know, it's this museum on the tip of England and it's a small seaside town that artists have been visiting for 200 years. And they were saying, this sounds completely implausible. I really don't believe that this is the case. So I'm very glad that you could corroborate my story. And yeah, so I'm going to talk about a few things tonight. Partly, as Margaret mentioned, it's going to be looking at, I think, this kind of flourishing of artist-led education projects that we've seen over the course of the last decade, and looking a little at how kind of museums have been responding to those so far, and then maybe some suggestions about what else could be drawn from that. So, Lure of the Local, my title, as maybe some of you have kind of noticed, is taken from Lucy Lippard, the American critic, curator, activist. And it's from a book she wrote in 1997 that was reflecting on critical regionalism, political ecology, and kind of site specificity, but writing from her location in New Mexico, where she's lived for about 20 years now. It's a book that in the last year I've returned to a lot since having moved from London to St Ives, thinking about what it means to be kind of some way from the traditional centre and to be kind of located a 5.5-hour train journey from London. So Lippard starts the book by stating that place for me is the locus of desire. And she goes on to define the lure of the local as the pull of place that operates on each of us, exposing our politics and our spiritual legacies. The lure of the local is that undertone to modern life that connects it to the past we know so little about and the future we are aimlessly concocting. Culture is usually understood to be what defines place and its meaning to people, she writes, but place equally defines culture. So I wanted to take this as a starting point because, as kind of Margaret has touched upon, St Ives is a place that's been unusually defined by its culture, and I think in some certain ways, in restricting ways also. I think by way of introduction, I just want to give a bit of an overview about what exactly this museum is doing on the tip of the southwest. For those of you who haven't visited, where exactly it is. And so it's on a kind of tiny spit of land in the county of Cornwall, which has historically been very remote from London. It wasn't until a bridge was built in the 1860s that it made it somehow a bit more accessible. But even now, 150 years later, there's still a very strongly felt separatist movement. When people go to visit, they often remark that it doesn't feel much like Britain. And that's partly because there are palm trees and kind of sandy beaches, but it's partly because it feels like somehow connected to elsewhere, whether that's Ireland or the kind of northwest coast of France. So it's this interesting place, and it's drawn artists there for 200 years. Partly that's to do with the quality of the light that's continually kind of talked about. And I was very resistant to this idea when I first moved, that there was anything very special about the light. And then after about 6 months, I had to kind of agree that, yeah, it was quite special. And the reason it is so beautiful is because it's surrounded on 3 sides by the Atlantic. So you get these kind of amazing refractions and this kind of amazing kind of luminescence in the air. So artists have been visiting all the way back from about kind of 1811. Turner was one of the first people to visit. And this is an image from one of the thousands of notebooks and sketchbooks that Turner left to the Tate, actually. And it's a view, you can't quite see it, it's like slightly faded, but it's looking across Porthminster Beach, which is just round the corner from where the museum sits today. And artists continued to come through the 19th century, but it remained essentially quite a kind of rough, quite industrialized region. There were 2 main industries in Cornwall. One was fishing, kind of pilchard fishing, and one was tin mining. And something kind of happened in the 1860s, which is that both of those industries essentially disappeared. The fish went elsewhere, the tin was suddenly mined out, and so it suddenly became a huge center of poverty and deprivation. And quite presciently, I think, the council started to try to, in a way that we're very familiar with today, refashion it as a kind of creative hub. They started to think of this as a place that artists could come to. So suddenly you had this town that had lots of empty fishing lofts and where all of the kind of sailors and fishermen had once been. But these places that were perfect for artist studios. They were kind of top lit, they were looking out over the ocean. And so the council started to bring artists down there. There was a train line built. And as early as about the 1870s, you get these kind of accounts of it written in touristic kind of magazines and pamphlets. And one I came across recently said that St Ives is a perfect place for the artist, the tourist, or the invalid, which is kind of an amazing trio and maybe one that's slightly blurred in some places. But this is, you can kind of get a sense of the town. And I live just next to the church there, and it hasn't really changed very much at all, aside from the kind of horses down by the harbour. But by the 1880s, it really was a kind of place that artists would go, and there was already a kind of large-scale exhibitions happening at the Royal Academy of Arts in London of the art of this region. It was a kind of a known centre. And actually throughout Europe and North America, the 1880s through to about the 1910s, you see this real flourishing of artist communities and artist colonies. So you see that in like Laguna Beach in California through to Denmark, and I'm sure there are probably analogues in Turkey too. So Whistler visited for a couple of years when he was just coming kind of off the back of his kind of horrible lawsuit with Ruskin that had left him almost destitute. And he switched scale and started making these really quite small paintings when he was in St Ives, and it was quite a turning point for him. And he was very influential, as you can kind of tell from this image by William Evelyn Osborne made 10 years later, which is just of the harbour, just round the back of where the museum stands today. So through the kind of 20s, it was a place of craft as well as art, and also literature. Virginia Woolf spent many years there as a young woman, and D.H. Lawrence lived in St Ives for 2 years in the late 1910s, and it was where he wrote The Rainbow. So it was really this crucible of a kind of like literary modernism as well as artistic. But then the major shift happened in 1939 with the outbreak of war. And with a trio of 3 artists who were based in Hampstead in the northwest of London, who made the decision to move out of London to flee the war and to St Ives. And that trio was Barbara Hepworth, sculptor, her husband Ben Nicholson, and then the Russian emigre artist Naum Garbo, who had already fled Moscow to Paris, and then Paris to London, then London to St Ives. And there was this kind of sense that if you were an artist living in London in 1939 and you wanted to get out, you would go either to New York or you would go to St Ives, kind of as improbable as that might sound. And so by some kind of fluke, all of the surrealists ended up going to New York, and all of the people working with like geometric abstraction, like Hepworth and Nicholson, Garbo, went to St Ives. So it became this kind of bastion of a kind of 1930s avant-gardism, but all the while kind of in the context of this small fishing village. The other artist on this slide, Alfred Wallace, was a retired deep-sea fisherman who Nicholson and his friend, the painter Christopher Wood, had met when they first went to St Ives in 1928. At the time, Wallace was in his 70s. He just lost his wife. And to kind of get over the melancholy of his bereavement, he'd taken to painting without any kind of formal training. And he'd started to paint just using kind of household paint on pieces of driftwood and ply, these kind of images of his life at sea, these kind of remembered images of St Ives and the ocean. And for Nicholson and Wood and a whole generation of like British modernist artists, it was a really important encounter. It kind of showed them a way out of this like Mondrian-derived kind of hard-edged abstraction to something really much more hand-hewn, hand-crafted, and what they kind of saw as kind of somehow like natural. And so Wallace is this rare example in 20th century British art of a kind of outsider artist. He's in the Tate collection, the only artist you would really define as kind of amateur or folk or self-trained who's in the collection. But you have these kind of two strands of British modernism at that point, one looking to a figure like Wallace and another looking to somebody like Mondrian. So after the war, a new generation emerged. They were people like Patrick Heron, who was a conscientious objector, who had worked at the Leach Pottery in St Ives during the war. And the painting on the top left, I think, was actually made in 1951, the same year as the painting behind me. And you can kind of see really made under the spell of Braque, and he was kind of figuring his way through the influence of the French modern masters at that stage, just on the kind of the moment before he would start to see the work of the New York painters like Jackson Pollock and Rothko. And he actually kept up a correspondence with Rothko for many years. And Rothko visited St Ives in the late 50s, and they, until his death, would kind of argue about who came up with certain kind of breakthroughs first. Peter Lanyon was one of the few of these artists who was actually from St Ives, was actually kind of local. But all of these artists in different ways are trying to kind of assimilate the legacy of French painting of the 30s and 40s with what they were just starting to see from the other side of the Atlantic. So I've already mentioned Barbara Hepworth, and she moved to St Ives in 1939, but in the late 40s, early 50s, acquired this beautiful garden right in the center of town, just a few minutes walk from where the museum is based today. She died there in 1975, and less than a year later, her garden and studio was open to the public. You can see these kind of images of her working there, and it's really been preserved in that way since then. Tate took over the management of the studio back in 1980, and we remain the only one of the 4 Tate museums to actually have a studio museum, and it's quite an unusual thing, a studio museum. The other kind of equivalents in the UK would be something like the Francis Bacon studio that was moved wholesale from London to Dublin. So it's a kind of reconstruction of a scenario, just a bit like the Brancusi in Paris. But this is actually just as she left it, and it really feels like she just walked out, and it's the kind of intention of the director of its time that it would be kept in that kind of way. So I suppose for me, Tate St Ives was this kind of place that always had like artists at its center. I knew it from childhood, and I'd kind of visit with my family. And it's this kind of place where it's only really in St Ives because artists kind of once lived there and continue to live there. And someone was telling me recently that per capita St Ives has more artists than kind of anywhere else in Europe. And it kind of feels that way. It's a tiny town of 11,000 people, but there are about 100 galleries there, which kind of makes it a useless place to live. You can't buy milk, but you can get some kind of pictures framed. So the kind of reason that Tate came there, a lot of that had to do with an exhibition that was organized at what was then the Tate Gallery in London, now Tate Britain, in 1985, that was a survey of the modernist work of St Ives. And that really revived this tradition that had been maybe slightly forgotten, had become slightly unfashionable. It was around the time when Tate Liverpool was being opened in 1988. And so people started to say, well, there should be a kind of a Tate of the South. People started to look at like Bristol and Norwich as different kind of potential venues. But then because of the excitement around this exhibition, it was the connection with Hepworth, it was decided that it should be in St Ives. So this quite unlikely plot of land was acquired, a kind of a former gasworks. And then the museum itself eventually opened in 1993. And you can kind of see that the curve of the gas cylinder was actually preserved in these quite unusual galleries that just look over the ocean. And for the first few years, the museum really just only exhibited the work of that kind of mid-century British modernist generation. Very quickly, it turned more towards a kind of international modernism, and you can see here an exhibition from several years ago of Martin Creed that filled half of that space with balloons. I'm sorry? So it's built around a kind of a central rotunda space. And then there are a further 7 galleries. And each one of the galleries is kind of built according to a footprint of a local artist's studio. So it's this quite kind of intimate space for viewing art, but also quite an unusual one that's really about like situating this work in the landscape that inspired it, I suppose. So we're kind of just on the kind of brink of something new happening, which is that we're about to build this an extension which will double the gallery space and will mean that rather than 1 exhibition at a time, we'll actually be able to have 3. So we'll be able to work much more with international contemporary work and kind of new commissions alongside exhibiting the work of St Ives and the Tate collection too. So that will open in exactly 2 years from today, so do come visit. This is a rendering of what the gallery will look like. So I suppose my sense of Tate St Ives has always been that it's this kind of artist's museum. And it kind of seems fitting that we're the only Tate to have an artist residency program too, which started about 18 months ago. And I've only been there for 12 months, but one of my ambitions for this program is that it shouldn't only be open to artists, it should be kind of reflective of this legacy, this quite broad legacy of St Ives, of kind of literary, musical, different kinds of avant-gardes. And so we're going to be inviting writers, curators, musicians, as well as organizations to be in residence. So we would have a kind of organization kind of within the organization, organizing different strands of our research or public programs. So I just wanted to give a very quick sense, before I kind of properly get started, of some of the artists who've come through. The first was Linda Stirling, she just goes by Linda, who I'm sure many of you will know or at least be familiar with. This is some of her earlier work. She was working in Manchester in the late 70s, was very close with that generation of bands like Joy Division, Buzzcocks, who she did the album cover of their debut LP. And she was a kind of a performance artist as well as a collage artist. If you've seen that kind of the Lady Gaga thing with the meat dress, like Linda did that in 1978. And she was kind of consistently ahead of her time and consistently not working in cities. So has been kind of, until about the last 5 or 10 years, somewhat overlooked. But she came to St Ives after a kind of very busy few years where she'd had a major retrospective in Paris at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville. She already had a connection with us, that she'd been in a group show called The Dark Monarch, which my predecessor Martin Clark organized, and was a kind of survey of magic and modernity and kind of occult practices between the war. She did this kind of performance just on the beach in front of the museum. But then last year she presented a ballet that was inspired by a Barbara Hepworth sculpture called The Ultimate Form, and that toured from Paris, where it was done in the Matisse room at the museum there, to the Hepworth Wakefield, and then finally finishing in St Ives. So that's going to be something that really is quite important for us as we continue this kind of having artists really at the core of the organization. And I think working out like how flexible we can be. You know, for me, coming from a more like an independent curatorial practice, it was quite a surprise at some of the kind of the rhythms or the kind of the pace of an institution the size of Tate. And having artists or musicians or writers really embedded, I think, is a way of rethinking some of those restrictions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project called Open School East, which I co-founded with friends in London about 2 years ago now. And essentially, I mean, it's an art school and a community centre combined as one, housed in a former public library in East London. And I mean, libraries have been being closed consistently across the UK for about the last 5 years. Like 250 have been closed. So you have all of these spaces. And with friends, we kind of found this space and started to talk about the possibility of kind of reopening it as a kind of public venue. Our initial idea was that it should be a kind of subsidized studios for young artists, but with a quite busy lecture program. And that really quickly shifted to saying, well, isn't that like some kind of school in a sense? It seems like you're kind of providing an art school. All of us have been teaching at art schools, and we were all quite frustrated with, well, a number of things, but primarily the kind of the fact that it was suddenly prohibitively expensive to study at art schools in the UK. Tuition fees had tripled. So a lot of people were suddenly kind of excluded from that. We wanted to kind of create an art school that was really quite rooted in its neighborhood. So rather than closing the studio door, it would be much more outward looking or sociable. rather than having a kind of single degree show at the end of the year, it would have moments of visibility throughout. So it would really be about training artists to kind of meet their public and collaborate with their publics really, really early on. So we kind of quickly gathered funding from the Barbican and from a number of other kind of sources, and managed to get hold of the building, which opened its doors in September 2013. We put out an international call for entries and had about 300 people apply. We filled about a dozen spaces in the end, a dozen studio spaces, with these kind of a mixture of young artists and writers. They're from a very broad range of backgrounds. We said that we didn't want any kind of formal academic qualifications, so they ranged from a kind of a commercial dancer through to somebody who had a PhD in anthropology. And the kind of that breadth, I suppose, was reflected in the breadth of tutors who were teaching in that first year, who kind of ranged from artists, from like Turner Prize winning artists, through to philosophers, critics, musicians, filmmakers. And so rather than develop a degree show, each of these 12 associates were really encouraged to develop a certain kind of project that would live beyond the length of the academic year itself. They each got a free studio for a year, and they each got free tuition. But kind of in lieu of those tuition fees, they took a really active role in reopening this public space and kind of working with different community groups. So a lot of the teaching itself was kind of open to anybody. Whenever it was possible, we would let anybody kind of who was interested come to classes and crits. So we had a dozen core students, but actually on any one given day, we might have 100 people visiting a seminar. And so it became this kind of really open form of education. And after the first term, each of the associates actually started to program the teaching themselves. We gave them budget, and they would invite tutors. So it became a completely kind of self-organized institution really early on. And that was, again, a kind of a way of trying to teach or train people to work within small-scale institutions. So kind of other projects we've done, they're kind of different kinds of event series. This is something from the first year. Through to a radio show that we run every Saturday from the seminar room, which is just in the top right-hand corner. And a big part of the idea for this project was that it would have a seminar room that was used for teaching during the day, but then in the evening anybody could rent it, and it would be free to use. This project developed quite quickly, and it's a radio show that's completely run by people from the local neighborhood over the age of 60 or under the age of 18. And because of the kind of community that's in, I mean, lots of Turkish people, lots of West African and West Indian. So you get this kind of amazing mix of people playing kind of music from their childhoods and from their teens. So again, that's a kind of project that just runs itself at this stage. Another thing we did quite early on was to set up a project with a young artist named Aaron Angel, who's an artist working with ceramics in London. And at this kind of moment in London and maybe elsewhere, a lot of younger artists are going back to working with clay again. But kind of ironically, this has happened at a moment when lots of art schools are actually kind of closing their ceramics departments. And so Aaron has set up this project that he calls Troytown Art Pottery. He calls a kind of psychedelic workshop for artists, and runs a series of residencies. 4 people come through every month, people who've never used clay before, and he teaches them how to use kind of glaze libraries and how to work with a kiln. So in a way, Troytown is a kind of almost like quasi-autonomous like department of the school that Aaron kind of runs, but it kind of, again, just runs in parallel to what we're doing otherwise. This is Aaron's project space, which is an aquarium in the pottery itself, and you can kind of see the small axolotls there. And so every month, the different artist installs some of their work that they've made in the pottery itself in the aquarium. And this has been shown several times now across Europe in different contexts. So the school itself has this kind of life beyond the walls of the building. So, I mean, this kind of is part, I think, of a much broader context. In this last decade, we've really seen this kind of flourishing of exactly this kind of self-organized, grassroots, DIY approaches to education. And they take all kinds of different forms, kind of online projects like the public school, which started life in Los Angeles, projects like Ahmet Oğuz's Silent University. But often they take places in cities like Mexico City that don't really have kind of adequate art schools currently, and they're set up exactly by artists who are frustrated with that situation. But that's not always the case. In the kind of case of the Mountain School of Arts in Los Angeles, it's in a city where there are kind of 7 or 8, amazing MFA programs. But as a result of that, you've got this really high density of young artists coming out of art school, and I think wanting to continue that kind of support structure after the art school itself. So in a sense, these things are not exactly alternative MFAs. They're almost a kind of supplement to the existing MFA system. They're a kind of way of forming your own kind of networks too. There was an essay written a couple of years ago by Anton Vidokul, the kind of founder of eFlux, saying that the kind of crisis of education is a crisis of distribution, and pointing to the fact that the kind of the most prestigious MFAs internationally remain in North America and parts of Western Europe. But I think that this has really shifted in the last couple of years, and as I hope I'm going to kind of show, many of these projects are starting at exactly the kind of places that don't have those kinds of established courses. So they would be places like Rupert in Vilnius, which has been running for several years now and is now kind of highly professionalized, through to kind of much smaller nomadic projects, like a shepherd's school on the bottom right, which is run by Fernando Garcia Dori, a Spanish artist. And it's a kind of guild for shepherds in the Basque region, and a kind of almost a union and a way of professionalizing and supporting them. But it doesn't have any kind of headquarters, and it's a very difficult thing to represent. As many of these kind of projects are, you just end up with photos of people sitting around kind of coffee tables and so on. But I mean, kind of why is this happening now? I mean, the really obvious question is student debt. Just to take the example of America's student debt, there is now around $1.2 trillion, which is more than credit card debt, not that far behind mortgage debt, but it'd probably be overtaking it. UK is not that far developed yet, but it's kind of getting close. It emerged recently that of people who are currently studying in universities in the UK, probably about 3/4 of them will never pay back their student loan. So we're really facing this moment when it's not just a kind of fact of like, what kind of art will you be making if you're pushed for money after art school? It's like, what kind of people do have access to art school? And so a big part of our thinking for Open School East was that this should be entirely free and it should be kind of entirely open. This image from 2 years ago is Cooper Union Art School in New York, which up until last year was the only free art school in New York. What you maybe can't quite make out is at the top of the image it's helium balloons carrying a kind of stack of pizzas. And there was a sit-in, a student sit-in in the president's office, protesting the kind of the introduction of fees. And this was a kind of thing organized by an artist collective called Bruce High Quality Foundation in New York. Bruce High Quality Foundation themselves actually run their own kind of what they call university that started in this kind of small space downtown. But they've done a number of kind of road trips too. So the kind of image on the left is this kind of limo version of a New York taxi cab that they took from coast to coast several years ago now. And I think what's notable with actually lots of these projects is that they are completely nomadic. Organized a seminar recently, and we were talking about how actually the kind of earliest definitions of school were always about movement. You know, you think about Aristotle and the kind of peripatetic school, or you kind of think about like a school of fish, and it kind of somehow a mobility or flexibility is somehow kind of feels quite central to the idea. And so many of these initiatives actually reject the idea of a kind of single building or a single institution in favor of something that kind of tracks a certain kind of route. And in some cases, there's a kind of politics to that. This is a project by Pablo Helguera, an artist who also runs the adult education program at MoMA. And lots of these projects are coming from people with institutional situations. He started it about 12 years ago, and it's called the School of Pan-American Unrest. And he essentially took this kind of tent that he called a kind of schoolhouse from Alaska, from Anchorage in Alaska, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. Every town they'd stop at, they'd run these kind of public workshops in town squares. So a kind of interesting thing that he has reflected on in the kind of context of MoMA kind of since, and has initiated research projects, but had this kind of entirely parallel, different kind of nomadic life. And many of these kind of projects too have an interesting relationship to the institution. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the Egyptian artist Wael Shawki. and his art school that he set up 5 years ago called Mass Alexandria, which was actually kind of included in the last documenta. One of the different formats of that was actually kind of hosted at the school, and they had a seminar. So there are kind of ways in which some of these projects kind of parasite themselves onto kind of existing institutions. I came across an essay recently by Suhail Malik, who teaches at Goldsmiths, and he writes that what's striking about these projects is that unlike previous generations, the recent artistic interests in education now look for education beyond the art school by literally replacing the site of art education in non-institutional settings, or more powerfully and visibly parasitizing, that's his word, I don't know if that's correct, parasitizing other kinds of art institutions as expanded educational initiatives. And what's really striking for me here is that lots of these kind of projects call themselves schools or academies or universities. And I think if you go back to the 60s, that would just never have been the case with these kind of counter-educational projects. You have the kind of anti-psychiatry movement in the UK in the 60s, which kind of gave birth to the anti-university movement. But it was all about rejecting the kind of prevailing hegemony of education and blah, 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 blah. But kind of what happens now is that people are, perhaps ironically, kind of claiming the guise of institutions, often kind of branding themselves as an academy or university, often kind of coming up with faux coats of arms or logos. And I mean, the kind of cynical, I suppose, response to that would be that it's about funding. You know, if you kind of present yourself as an institution, then you can draw certain funding streams. I think the kind of maybe more sympathetic version of that Gregory Shillette puts forward in an essay about this is that there's a kind of melancholy aspect to lots of these projects. It's almost a kind of mourning for the public institutions that in West Europe anyway were kind of lost in the 60s and 70s. And it's a kind of trying to recuperate some of those lost forms of discourse or dialogue. So I kind of one example that I'm sure you'll be familiar with, Ahmet Öğüt, Turkish artist and kind of sometime resident of Istanbul, started the Silent University several years ago. And for me, it's been a really important project. I was kind of in dialogue with Ahmet a lot about this. It's quite a difficult thing to describe, kind of what it is, quite a difficult thing to pin it down. Maybe some of you will kind of be better at it than I, but I'll give it a shot. It's a kind of way of teaching that is polyglot, that kind of doesn't have any kind of single language, but is also somehow silent. It's developed for different kinds of migrants and refugees, many of whom who held teaching positions in their kind of native countries, but then came to the UK and also came elsewhere, and because of the kind of language difficulties, couldn't get, you know, university positions. So it's a kind of quite informal set of conversations, or kind of no conversations rather, but a way of teaching that is entirely kind of silent. It's difficult to kind of get across, but the way that Ahmet puts it is that it's a self-institutionalized, autonomous knowledge platform that aims to challenge the idea of silence as a passive state. We hope to explore its powerful potential through performance, writing, and reflection. And so, I mean, so many of these kinds of projects really try to reject a kind of top-down, like, knowledge transaction by making things more self-organized or collaborative or anti-hierarchical. But I think Ahmet's project goes like a step further than that by kind of just rejecting language altogether. And these are kind of situations that have to be devised afresh every time by people not using language or kind of not speaking in the same language. It's interesting too in terms of its relationship to the institution that when it first started out in 2012, it was a collaboration between Tate, so a museum, Goldsmiths, a university, and then Delphina Foundation, a residency program based in London, but with kind of strong connections with the Middle East and North Africa. So it's this kind of way of using the resources of like really markedly different institutions to form a kind of another one that's the sum of its parts, or kind of more than the sum of its parts. And the Silent University's had a kind of considerable afterlife since then. It's been in a number of cities around the world, but including Tensta Konsthall in Stockholm. And so it will often, I suppose, kind of take the place of education initiatives, always working in this way that's not exactly kind of site-specific, but is kind of sensitive to the context of the place. So it can work just as well as it can in London with the kind of refugees or migrants there as it can in Stockholm or wherever else too. It's going to be included, I think, in the British Art Show this year in that opens in Leeds in October, and it will be touring for about a year and a half. So if you haven't seen it, there'll be plenty of opportunities. So I kind of mentioned at the beginning that we've been kind of seeing the ways in which museums have been responding to this kind of upsurge of DIY education projects. And I'd like to quote this line from Dieter Lesage, who's a Belgian theorist, who in a lecture 6 years ago said that the Art Academy is going to be the defining innovative institution within the art field in the next 20 years, much more so than museums, galleries, biennials, whatever. And what we've seen in the kind of 6 years since Lesage kind of wrote this, I think is a number of museums kind of trying to respond to that, or trying to kind of learn from these kinds of self-organized education initiatives. And they've done that in kind of ways that I would say are kind of more or less successful. I think all of this goes back, first of all, to Manifesto 6, which, as you'll know, it's a kind of a biennial, pan-European biennial, which since it was founded in the mid-90s has kind of moved venue every 2 years, often looking to the edges of Europe and often kind of trying to isolate zones of conflict or contestation, although the next one is in Zurich, so I kind of have no idea what that means. The kind of the signal event, I suppose, for all of this and all of the ways in which biennials and museums developing these kind of responses is Manifesto 6, which was a proposal made by 3 curators, Anton Vidokel, May Abu El Dahab, and I think Florian Waldvogel, for an art school which would be on the border in Nicosia in Cyprus, and would be a kind of art school as exhibition. Rather than having the standard biennial presentation, there would simply be an art school there. And I suppose, not unsurprisingly, it didn't happen. It got cancelled before it could actually open. It's not entirely clear still, I think, what exactly happened, but, you know. What's important here, though, is that Manifesto 6 had a really significant afterlife. First, the kind of art school opened in Berlin as United Nations Plaza, and then it opened and ran for a whole year at the very top floor of the New Museum in New York. So again, there's this way in which these things are actually absorbed by institutions, or kind of become some kind of para-educational programs within institutions. Kind of more recently, in London, there was, for the whole of the summer, the Hayward Gallery described itself as an art school, or kind of wide open school. And I was hunting around for kind of images of these, and lots of them have this kind of feel of like 60s-ish, like kind of happenings, these kind of quite loose groupings of people. I would say I'm kind of somewhat skeptical about this idea of claiming a museum as a school for a season, because I think if a school is worth anything, it's worth a kind of longer-term conversation, or a kind of proper rootedness in a community, or a kind of turnover of students. We've seen this with Open School East. I felt that the first year didn't really become legible till a kind of second year's worth of students came through. So I think there's been a kind of a fad or a bit of a trend with some of this in terms of exhibition making. In the last few years, you get these kinds of examples of projects like this at PS1 a couple of years ago, called School Speculations, The Future Is. And really all it is a kind of public program of talks set up in a kind of bespoke kind of auditorium. But it doesn't have so much to do with school, I think, short of kind of linking it to a certain discourse. And I think probably one thing to note with all of these projects is that they're taking place in cities like London, like New York, or I think there's one, Berkeley as well, that have been the sites of significant student protest in the last few years as well. So I think it's a way in which museums are trying to kind of absorb or kind of support some of these discourses and practices. I know my colleague Chris Durkin was talking here a month or two ago, and he often says that one thing that museums do so well is to actually kind of to support, to nurture the kinds of practices that are under threat otherwise, whether that's kind of a certain form of dance which isn't finding much traction elsewhere, whether it's a kind of form of radical education. Museums are particularly well suited in kind of some places to actually support and to foster that kind of dialogue. So The Possible, which was at the Berkeley Art Museum last summer, was a kind of attempt to return to the kind of radical early years of the Berkeley Art Museum, which was founded in 1965, turning all of its galleries into these quite open kind of classroom spaces. So I think it's something there's definitely been this tendency the last 5 years, but I would kind of have several caveats or kind of skepticisms about some of the intentions behind these projects. So I suppose instead I'd like to kind of think back to projects like Ahmet's Silent University, or like Pablo Helguera's Nomadic, School of Pan-American Unrest, to kind of think towards a model of museums that could be, rather than monolithic, somehow dispersed, rather than kind of providing some broader kind of, transcendent sense of art history, something that's much more contingent or much more aware of the idea that there are parallel modernisms, kind of parallel and equal modernisms happening, and all kinds of different stories and narratives that have yet to be told, and that the museum could be exactly the place to kind of produce those kinds of discourses, always with a real sense of what the local or the kind of location might be. So I think just kind of by way of conclusion, I want to go back to Lucy Lippard, who I started with, and to an essay that she wrote in 2011, really reflecting back on her book, The Lure of the Local. She's writing this from where she lives in New Mexico, writing about Santa Fe and also Reykjavik, two places that she describes as kind of both marginalized and romanticized. And I think for me, from my kind of St Ives context, that is a kind of pairing that I'm also acutely aware of. But Lippard writes that no matter how long or short a time we live in a place, we inherit the responsibility for knowing about it, valuing it, working to keep it viable, and illuminating our dynamic cultural spaces and their underlying, often invisible meanings and uses. So a kind of sentiment I'm sure we're all quite familiar with. And she concludes the essay by arguing that if a local is someone who gives more than she takes, everybody is a candidate. So I think I'm going to leave it there, but I would welcome comments or questions. Thank you. Anybody? Hey.
Hi. Can you maybe elaborate on some of the failures that you encountered opening up that alternative school that you guys had? Like, what were some of the obstacles and failures?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think the initial failure, or kind of that we encountered, was that we had to program the first term's curriculum very, very quickly, because we put a call for entry out, and we had to have a curriculum in place. So we essentially called about 30 people within our network, always with this kind of idea in mind that there'd be a third artist, a third kind of whoever, and a third someone else, to have this kind of broad range. But the other decision, which I think was probably a failure, was that we wanted to really kind of connect it with the history of radical community centres in East London, and also the kind of longer history of experimental education in the UK. So going back to things like the kind of a Hornsey sit-in of 1968, or the kind of anti-university movement that I mentioned already. So we programmed this really quite dense, quite intense month's worth of projects and seminars and symposia about that. And after the first month, all of the associates were just like, I'm sick of learning about schools from the 60s and 70s. And they wanted to start kind of getting on and to kind of make stuff. And so I suppose for us, it was this realization that a project we started out that was meant to be a much more about a kind of theoretical or kind of ambitious level of discourse, you kind of need to hold that in balance with the kind of, with practice and with making and so on. And it took a little while to kind of, for us to realize that. And I think too, what we wanted to do was to kind of be somewhat provocative or antagonistic with the associates, to kind of push people out of the more like the rhythms of working that they were used to. But I think for sure it's something that we kind of rethought second time round. We also realized that there was kind of little to no continuity in the people who were teaching. So in the first year, we had 80 people teach at Open School East, which is way too much. And because mostly they'd be there for a day and wouldn't be coming back. So what we've done with the second year is to appoint 7 mentors who are going to be there for each of the 3 semesters. And all of the associates, there are 15 this year, all of them can kind of choose one or all of the mentors to have somebody who will be more of a kind of continual interlocutor for them, so they can actually kind of develop conversations and a project in dialogue with people, rather than just this kind of many, many voices. So I suppose those would be two kind of things. And then also just like, it takes time, And I suppose this is at the root of my kind of skepticism about some of these kind of one-off projects, that to actually build proper connections with a given neighborhood, it takes a long time to build that kind of trust, and we're kind of still getting there with that.
And is the school free, and then do you guys get continuous funding for it to allow the students to study? Or I'm just kind of curious, how do you deal with funding, obviously?
So what's the funding situation?
Yeah.
So it's currently it's completely free, and the tuition is free, and the studios are free. It's a shoestring kind of operation. There are 2 part-time directors and 1 administrator. We organised a kind of a benefit auction late last year, which is essentially providing a lot of the support for the next 18 months. After that, though, it's somewhat more precarious, and we're trying to work out, you know, I mean, the key to a lot of the projects I've mentioned is that they don't last very long. You know, the energy or the funding kind of runs out. So I think key for us now is how do you make this sustainable? And we've got kind of ideas, but I think after the 3rd year, which will be next year, we'll be looking at different kinds of approaches.
What are the requirements for the attendees?
What are the requirements
yeah.
for the school?
Yeah.
So there are no requirements whatsoever. So it's we kind of figured that because it's unaccredited, we couldn't really be asking for kind of a minimum of an MA or anything like that. But we decided too that the level of the teaching would be at a kind of MA or post-MA level. We were looking at things like the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York. And that really came out of a kind of sense that in London, I wouldn't want to kind of talk more broadly, but in London certainly, I think we were quite frustrated with the general level of discourse that was going on in the art schools, but also the kind of lack of face-to-face time that students were getting with tutors. That someone from St Martin's came to one of our seminars in the first term, and she was an international student, so paying 3 times the usual kind of tuition fees anyway, and she got 10 minutes tuition every term. So a kind of half an hour every year or something like that. So we wanted it to be much more intensive, kind of a day or 2 a week. But really crucially, it was going to be supporting people from a range of different backgrounds, kind of economic, social, but also kind of educational-wise. We wanted to have people who were filmmakers in the same room as people who were potters or kind of anthropologists. Really just a kind of way of recognizing that's the way artists are working today. And that, not exactly interdisciplinary, but just kind of ill-disciplined kind of way, I'd say, yeah. Any other questions?
As far as going back to St Ives, if you have residency program also part of the institution, how do you see that this aspect affects the programming of the exhibitions that you do make there that might be different than a museum that doesn't have a residency program in it?
So I suppose what I should have emphasized and maybe didn't about the residency program is that it's not really tied to exhibitions. Although Linda had been in exhibitions at points, her residency program was entirely open-ended. That what she decided to do in the end was to work on this kind of ballet. And it seemed, and it's called the Artists Program rather than the Residency Program. And we wanted it to be a kind of space that would be really kind of open-ended, where people wouldn't be under a pressure to just develop an exhibition, but would actually be encouraged to think in kinds of different ways. And that's one thing we're going to be doing much more of in the next year or 2, approaching artists and saying, like, is there one project that you've always wanted to do that's maybe a step away from your kind of usual practice? And so we've been talking to people recently who are primarily artist filmmakers but want to set up a record label, for example. And I mean, it could be a great thing to set up this record label for 6 months and have the kind of museum as the place that's developed, and maybe there would be performances or kind of nights, but it's not part of the exhibition program. The other part of that is that we want to be able to maybe tour certain elements of the residency program. So rather than thinking that exhibitions are the things that primarily get toured, things that we could kind of develop through residency, whether that's research or certain kind of events, would be things that could tour maybe to the other Tate sites.
Is that happening?
It's hoping to happen next year, yeah. Keep you posted. Yeah.
Could you also talk about a little bit about the relationship between these free education platforms on the one hand and, let's say, an institution like Goldsmiths supporting these institutions? I mean, what's the link there? Do you think Goldsmiths somehow learned something out of it, or or reflects its own experience as a, let's say, mostly known as an art institution,
Yeah.
though it's not an art institution.
Absolutely. No, I think often the funding is actually guaranteed only because there's a sense that it could be somehow reciprocal. So with Open School East, the initial grant was from the Barbican in London, but actually from a department of the Barbican that's split between them and Guildhall Schools, which is next door, and a kind of split department that's called Creative Learning. And they explicitly said to us that this was a kind of experiment that could take place like beyond the site of the Barbican itself. And, you know, so I guess if it kind of fails, it's not so much of a problem for them. But if it succeeds, it's things that they could actually take back and would inform their kind of strategy for education. So I think absolutely, I suppose I would wonder how much to date has actually been reabsorbed into those kinds of institutions that have been providing this funding. I mean, I hope it's something that is shifting the practice. Yeah. Final question? I think we should probably leave it there then. Thank you. Thank you very much.